Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very special session at siberXchange 3.0. My name is Tushar Singh. I'm the CEO and founder of Minute School. I'm joined in this totally non-car situated area to speak to you with these three auspicious speakers about digital currencies and securing them. Uh, I think it's a very timely conversation, especially as we're seeing a lot of changes in the finance sector. We're seeing an acceptance of many different types of systems, and we'll get into that a little bit with the speakers here to dig into the nuance of those, but then especially the security side. I'm joined by Danny Aniag, who is a certified CISO, certified ethical hacker, and certified information security auditor. Danny is founder and principal consultant of his cybersecurity firm that has performed multiple compliance technical projects. His projects range from financial institutions, government agencies, private corporations, and universities. Danny and his family are active volunteers in their community through sports and church activities. And Danny, we met initially at Durham College, I believe. Did I say your last name correctly?
Perfect, Tushar.
Oh my goodness. I think we're off to a really good start here. Danny will be one of the experts. Joining Danny as well as one of the experts here will be Asher Jaffri, who's a public servant with a passion to modernize the citizen experience at Richmond Hill. And Asher, can you just describe what that means to modernize the citizen experience at Richmond Hill?
Absolutely, sure. Glad to be here. First of all, as an enterprise architect by trade, my day starts and ends with the customer journey, making sure that our constituents, the taxpayer that live and breathe Richmond Hill service on a daily basis, are provided the most optimal experience, regardless of what channel they come in to the city of Richmond Hill. And that's what the transformation means.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And then our primary presenter is John Wetzel. John is the Director of Intelligence Solutions at Recorded Future, an intelligence company. He's been a professional for the past 17 years, starting in the US Army. In his free time, he enjoys flying drones, pretty solid, freelance photography, and good burgundy. And John, just to kind of start off with, I think, as a primary presenter and an expert in this space, I kind of want to dig into what you would consider the buckets when we speak about digital currencies. Because we speak about crypto, we speak about central bank digital currencies. Can you give us a little bit of background on that and the buckets that they would fall into?
Absolutely. And I think it's important I think there's a lot of like misconception about what each of these things are. For example, a digital wallet is not a digital currency, is not necessarily blockchain, right? And each of these things, we throw around these terms as almost interchangeable, but they really represent very different shifts in where the market actually is. Where I think about this is I think it really is like kind of inside or outside. Outside, everyone thinks about like the end user experience of like, I want to use Bitcoin to buy a pizza, right? And we all heard the story about the unfortunate soul that spent what was it? It was like 10,000 Bitcoin early on to buy a pizza, and that I think a lot of people think about that and equate it as like, oh, wait, this thing is cash. This is value that I can actually spend in some place. But that's not the sole purpose of it, right? Like it can be used, and the technology that underpins it has a lot of different ways that it can be used. When you're thinking about like a bank that's rolling out, say, a digital wallet or a cryptocurrency wallet, if we're going to talk about that, that can be very end user facing. How do I protect that app? How do I protect that service? How do I make sure that it doesn't succumb to any one of the number of different frauds that have accosted that market space? The other side of it is more internal. And I think about this in terms of how are we going to roll out, maybe it is a client facing application, but like something like Apple Pay, where ultimately the goal of that is to simplify my client experience and also help protect my organization from being defrauded. We are still very much a chip and pin type of society where we're paying on these credit cards, but we see the potential of a digital wallet to actually alleviate that. It has a lot more requirements around how does this, validate payment? How do we authenticate this? How do we do this? And internally, even we have this idea that there's ways that both digital wallets and cryptocurrency can work to improve our organization even more than that. When we think about the challenges that face a modern digitizing bank, and I think that's a term that also gets thrown around a lot. But let's face it, we have financial organizations that are running on COBOL, that are scanning PDFs to try and send out updates to their clients. Yeah, it's a mobile app, but if it's scanning a PDF at the end of the day, how technologically capable is it? I think it's important to think about things like banks are concerned about how do we federate payment? How do we, clear payments faster between interbank organizations? If I can find a way to do that a day faster, I can recognize revenue a lot quicker. And that may not have any end use whatsoever for the person that's trying to buy a pizza, but it can have huge impacts on how efficient that bank actually is. And how do we do this in a way, hopefully, that reduces our risk surface?
Right, and I think that's an interesting preface to this conversation we're going to have here, because this is a significantly deep subject. And so for those participants that are on, those listeners that are on, we're going to attempt to give you a pretty good starting point on all of this. But it is something that you do need to dig into. As you can imagine, a lot of nuance that exists. And knowing how to categorize yourself is also pretty important. So let's start with one of those. And I think you'd mentioned it as well, John, is let's imagine a situation where a bank is rolling out digital wallets and powering digital means for remittances and coins. So, John, how would you advise a bank to get started from a threat monitoring perspective? What should they be paying attention to?
Ideally, they were paying attention a year ago before you started rolling it out. That was honestly the first thing I thought of when I was like looking at this particular question. Is I was talking with a CISO in a financial services company a month ago, and one of the things they told me is that with the pandemic, it has accelerated dramatically the digitalization of the space. And what has happened because of that is you have a lot of financial institutions that are trying to modernize and say, hey, how do we bring up these services to modern day standards? It's either A, I'm trying to take all my COBOL based apps and move them to a place that actually, is modern and works with modern infrastructure, hopefully not just Java. And two, how do I actually build out whatever that next thing is going to be, whether it's a digital wallet, whether it's encouraging cryptocurrency payments and things like that? And the common consensus was really this: they need to get in there today. They need to be already working on AppSec and DevSecOps and baking them in hard right now. Because if they wait a year, it's gone. The train has already left the station and they won't get another chance to do it. And you're talking about this particular moment is the time that they can bake it in and eliminate that 20 years in the future legacy debt that we're suffering from right now.
So I think that's interesting. Before I get to the advisors on this, you're saying they should have started a year ago on this. Is just thinking about it now at the end or even in the middle is too late?
If they're rolling out the application, I mean, we see this all the time in security. If they're rolling out the application, or if they're doing, and this is anything, if they're registering the marketing domain for the thing, if they've already created a campaign around it, if they've done all these other things, and security wasn't an integral part of that process during the program creation, during the app ideation, during the engineering cycles that you did it, when you're not baking it into the testing and development of that, then if you're just talking about today we're rolling it out, that's problematic. And I think that's one of the challenges that we see in a lot of, I'm not going to, too fine a point on it, but when you're talking about like, supply chain risk and we're talking about these applications that are built, this is a big part of it. I think there are things that we do in security to try and scramble, but in the ideal state, your teams are integrated enough and you've broken down enough of those silos that it becomes a hard baked in thing of like, how do we deal with this situation?
All right, thank you. Danny, what are your thoughts on this approach and anything you'd like to add to it?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with John. There's still a lot that needs to be done and it has to be done, I mean, a year ago, right? So my take on this is that if I am, let's say, a CISO going to deploy a digital wallet going forward, I have to remember two things. Number one, the basics. Start with the basics all the time. So be aware that if you're deploying that, the actual attack vectors includes not just the client side, but the web server and the web app itself. So attacks such as session hijacking, it was mentioned a while ago, the denial of service attack, cross-site, SQL injection, XSS, command injection, directory traversal. This has to all be addressed right away. And you can do that, number one, by making sure that, start off with placing your web servers in a secure infrastructure, right? You got your DMZ, you get your external firewall, and you got your internal firewall. Make sure that the patches and updates are properly up to date, the protocols, right? The ports, the ICMP, all of those, and countermeasures in terms of your accounts, files, and directories. Try to refrain directory traversal from happening. Now, those are the basic, simple things that a typical certified ethical hacker can actually advise you to remediate before cutting over to production. But the advanced portion here, and that was kind of a theme in today's discussion, was what are the future leading events, so that we can now plan right away. So in terms of that, I would say one of the things that we have to remember is that, you know, within a decade, right? Quantum computers could be powerful enough to break all cryptography security that we have right now, that protects our cell phones, our bank accounts, our email addresses, and yet, yes, your Bitcoin wallets as well. So if you're a state sponsor, for instance, and I'm not going to mention a country here. So if you have a quantum computer today and you're a state sponsor, probably in the next 8 years, you could crack wallets on the blockchain. And that's exactly one of the observation that was made by Fred Thiel, the CEO of cryptocurrency for Marathon Digital Holdings, and I believe in that is going to really happen, simply because there is no quantum resistant encryption protocol yet that has been made. NIST is now developing a standard, but it has to be done right away, probably in the next 2 years. It's not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. That being said, the possibility of these quantum computers being able to hack our asymmetric cryptography, the private public key pairing, which is basically what governs all of our encryption technologies, that can easily be hacked with quantum computers going forward. So without the standards for quantum computing safe protocol and encryption that is quantum computing based, we are still unfortunately going to use the basic asymmetric kind of encryption protocol, which I believe can easily be hacked in the next probably 5-8 years using quantum computers. And that's what really scares me. I'm not being pessimistic here, Tushar. I'm just being realistic. But that's the truth of the matter. That's the lay of the land. We don't have a standard yet for quantum safe computing and cryptography, and we need to get that. Other companies have already started building their quantum safe computing encryption, like Ironclad. But the thing is, there's got to be some sort of a regulatory body to put in place a standard right away for other players to come in and come up with their quantum computing safe protocols. I think that's what we need to going forward in terms of the advanced side of things.
Okay, no, thank you. And it is something that I think we have to flag and kind of put on our roadmap. Asher, any thoughts on the approach for what we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. I mean, just building on what Danny mentioned, and again, there is weight in terms of putting in the controls and mechanism in place, whether that's a NIST standard and ISO framework that's introduced for the digital currency. But I take it back to why we're doing this. Why is there a need for digital? I mean, we've seen collectively because of the pandemic a push towards more digital. Folks their level of comfort has grown significantly in terms of using a digital wallet or digital currencies in general. I break the point about educating the end user regarding when you build in defense and layers, there is control and mitigations that we need to put in on the back end side of things, but the front end side of things, making sure that when the bank is launching these things, there is enough policies and frameworks, but also educating the end users, putting in the biometrics, putting in some sort of basic authentication. So me as an end user, there is a level of comfort when I'm using this. The other part regarding both quantum and laying out the future, if there is a tech vector that needs to be leveraged or utilized in the future, we also have the conversation about trust in the platform, trust in the technology as an end user. But at the end of the day, what happens when the back-end supply chain is no longer there? I mean, as an end user, how much power do I have to use that digital wallet if the actual mechanism behind the scenes is offline? If I go to a convenience store and I realize that the bank that I deal with is completely offline due to another, whether that's an attack on their side, but now I'm now left in a situation where I have potential funds and I'm unable to use their services. So that needs to be acknowledged and accounted for when we do talk about digital currency and digital wallet.
Thank you. And I think we've dove in quite a ways here, and I kind of want to pull us back a little bit to talk about this sort of situation and with what we're currently dealing with. John, can you discuss how you'd conduct a vulnerability analysis in this situation, and what would recorded future bring to this situation?
So I think the first thing you have to know is like what's actually happening. I, I think we're a little bit away from quantum computing being actively applied, and I'm actually of the slightly more, I don't know, it's either optimistic or way more pessimistic view, depending on which you take it, is that once we're able to have that capability of quantum computing to be able to actually crack down on cryptography, I think it's still going to be delayed in rolling out, mainly because they don't have to. Like you're seeing organizations at the nation state level cracking encrypted messaging, mainly because we haven't applied the standards very well. You're already seeing criminals being able to how many of the apps that we use nowadays, even on the financial services thing, are really susceptible to man in the middle because we just haven't applied. We're still using HTTP as opposed to HTTPS, or they're just sniffing on the keys right in the middle. Like, we're still not great at applying the things that we know work right now, let alone the future state of them. And I think we see criminals taking advantage of that. Like, my first area on vulnerability assessment is always looking at what's actually happening and how is a criminal going to approach it. Because there are, I think you and me and everyone else looks at the vulnerability statements that come out there. And if you have the threat mindset of it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like code execution, but you have to be local in order to do it. Well, I don't care about that, right? Because we know that the threat actor is probably not going to stick their neck out that far for it. If you look at what the threat environment is right now for any kind of new application that's coming out for financial services, one, it's getting RE'd. They're going to throw it into IDA and they're going to try and figure out like how it works. They're going to look and run it live and figure out like, hey, how can I, basically, where is this crack from a technological standpoint? In the meantime, they're going to use the same things that they've approached it in every other way. Oh, how are you informing your users? How is this getting rolled out? Is it in an app store? Did you use an email announcement on it? If you use an email announcement to initially create coins or create you're gifting something away, you're doing something for free, that's the easiest attack venue in the world because I already have an infrastructure set up for phishing. It's never the direct thing. It's always the thing aside from it, right? And we saw that with Kaseya. People are trying to fish out saying, hey, we've got your patch for Kaseya right now. Just go ahead and click on this link and we'll give you all the information on it. Actors are always going to go for the kind of that least amount of effort they need to in order to be able to do it. And they'll fish at scale. They'll go for larger, and I'm not just talking about phishing in messages, they'll go at a larger approach in scale. They're also going to look at kind of, hey, how is this set up and how is this identifying users? What are we using aside from password or even token-based authentication to try and identify who these users are? And we've seen like kind of really smart innovation in the sector. Like, look at the rise of Genesis Store. Genesis Store, for those of you who may not know, is a place that is a market space for bad guys to basically buy the closest thing to you as they can. Essentially, it's an affected machine where they've compromised it. And what it is it appears to counter what originally started as a financial and retail sector countermeasure to being able to identify who you are. Hey, let's look at the full profile, the full fingerprint of what you actually are. Your cookies, the apps you have installed on your phone or on your browser. Let's look at anything else that we can touch. Your user agent. Let's see what language settings that you have. Pull all that back and use that as a fingerprint to identify, is this actually where you are? Genesis Store says, hey, we'll sell you that profile for all these different accounts, and actors can go on there and buy them either individually or in bulk. You can buy an entire user persona, no matter what their login, for pennies on the dollar. Sometimes it's like $4 if it's something really good. And if you think about that, that's fraud at almost its truest state. How do I become this other user based on everything else they have, their entire digital fingerprint, and try and fraudulently approach that? I think you might see the same thing because ultimately you're going to have an actor that is trying to log into the account. If it's at a point-by-point level, the actors are not going to do it. They're always looking at it to figure out, how do I hack at scale? I don't buy one Genesis Store bot. I buy 1,000 of them. I don't buy one access agent in order to be able to deploy ransomware. I buy 10,000 of them to try and figure it out. We see it in carding as well. I don't want one or two cards. I'll buy a bulk drop of cards and then have to scan them. And there's an entire economy around how do I get this? Does it have track 2 data? And they're really, really good at figuring out, is this a point-by-point thing, which is they don't deal with it, or is it hacking at scale? Those to me are the biggest threats that you're trying to figure out is like, I need to make sure this doesn't become a supply chain threat because I don't want to become that company. 2, how do I make sure that I force the bad guys to make hard choices? I really want to make them pay a lot. Like if I have to force them to pay $10 per user, that may sound trivial, but to them, they can't hack at scale at that cost. If I have to pay $10 or $100, even if it's $1,000 payday, I'm not going to do it because I can't afford to do it at scale. And I think those are the ways that you win in creating an app like this. And so when I was doing that, you're figuring out what are the actors doing, what's our security against it, and how do I enforce cost on a bad guy at a vulnerability level?
So kind of just building on that, and I apologize for my sneeze. I thought I'd muted myself there, but hopefully that didn't come through too much for the listeners. So what would Recorded Future bring to this situation? Like how would, because you've kind of identified 3 major areas of this. So how do we actually tackle that?
Sure. I was in a meeting earlier today where we're talking about trying to figure out how do we say what we do? And somebody said, well, what we do is we do automated collection and then validate it with humans. And I said, actually, what we do is the opposite. We do human-focused collection with automation on the processing of it. I think that's what sets us as key. One thing is sourcing. Where are you identifying where threats actually live? We interact with threats, and by threats, I always mean people, because there's not like a computer somewhere that's hyper dangerous. As much as Shodan is the most dangerous search engine in the world, it's still an automation thing. And all credit to John for that one. But ultimately, one, it's knowing your bad guys. Are you in their marketplaces? Are you in their forums? Are you there for discussion? Do you know what's of interest to them, and do you know how it is? One, we do have humans that interact with that, but we also harvest that at scale. We know the Russian criminal underground forums where people are talking and sharing exploits. We know about how the market spaces work and whether or not something is going to be peak interest of that. What you're concerned about is not the individual hacker that may find a particular vulnerability, but whether or not that can be monetized at scale, because that's what the criminal underground is going to be going. And that's also where we're going to be able to provide a lot of insight there as you're trying to figure out all right, what are the threats that we have to prioritize when we're developing this app? You can't stop everything. I think quantum computing is a great example of that. I probably can't come up with a good defensive measure against that right now, but I know that my business is going to roll it out anyways. How do I figure out what threats are being leveraged right now by the bad guys? Number 2, where do we see weaponization of current vulnerabilities? Because that's going to tell me the trend for the future. Vulnerabilities follow a pretty interesting weaponization pathway. They're discovered, people throw them out there. There's a POC that's out there. How did the POC get launched? Did somebody launch it on GitHub? Did somebody put it out on Twitter? Did somebody, an independent security researcher, do that? And they're just going through private channels to negotiate it. Getting insight into that POC is interesting because ultimately, most of the bad guy infrastructure, most of the threat actor infrastructure is really based around how easy can I use this? There are not a lot of malicious reverse engineers who are really sophisticated. In fact, one of the ways that, for example, Revil has gotten really good is because they're one of the groups that has really good cryptography. They've done a lot of good implementation on that. And it's one of the things that sets them above and beyond other threat actors. So by throwing a POC out there, now you've made it really easy for them to take that, strip it, and put it into their malware, because they always want to, they're not going to want to create something new. I can guarantee you there's a digital wallet, there's a brand new digital thing out there that they're going to have to hack against. In order to do it at scale, they're going to package it into a service that they can already provide. Ransomware as a service has shown that that's where it's going. Just as software as a service is the future for eating the world for everything else, they need to have these services packaged up that an end user can deploy, that an affiliate can deploy easily. And seeing where those trends are, what are the vulnerabilities, is it exploitable in that fashion, is really what we monitor for. We're seeing the pipeline of where vulnerabilities are being weaponized. We're seeing where we can identify that there are new POCs being launched there, and pulling that data in for a threat analyst to be able to understand and draw conclusions from. I could go on and on, but this is literally what I do for a job. And I don't think everybody wants to hear like a whole vendor spiel about like, oh, this is all the things Recorded Future does. Or maybe you do, in which case, please give me a call. But I think these are common sense things that we've tried to do. You can do this yourself. You can do it with Google. But what we've done is we've tried to make it easy and effective for an analyst to do this at scale in a kind of a single pane of glass approach.
So given that, Asher, do you think that analysts or team members are equipped to use tools like this? And I'm gonna ask you that question, then I'm gonna build on it as well for Danny.
Honestly, given what John said, I don't think given the threat script right now, given the recent implementation or given the recent anomaly we've seen with Kaseya, given the whole print festival that Microsoft unfolded, the folks aren't truly the folks that are supposed to be leading the conversation aren't there yet to call it to call it as it is. I mean, as an organization, as fundamental institutions, we are not ready to take those on conversation, have the technical skill set. Hence, when something does happen, we leverage on and rely on, again, different security vendors, different experts that have that niche built in. Otherwise, if the end users are proficient enough, we wouldn't have this conversation. That whole proactive approach isn't quite there. And given the ever-changing threat landscape, I don't think we will be ever at that level of playing catch up with the bad actors in the market.
Okay, and I think that's interesting. Now, when you're giving that response, would you say this is true for businesses of all sizes, or is it primarily focused on business of certain sizes?
I think the size conversation becomes quite mundane or irrelevant because we've seen organizations such as, again, you name it, the big fours, the people that were supposed to protect the organization, they went through and got their, again, game handed to them. This year has been, or the pandemic has been, a nightmare for all vendorship and forms of all organizations, irrespective of their scale. I think going back to the foundation, it's not a matter of if, but when. And when that does happen, where do you bring in those expertise, or you build that capability in-house, or you rely on a trusted network ecosystem where you can bring in resources such as record security and have those partnerships when you can build on those furthers and be ready for whatever the world throws at you.
Thank you. And Danny, do you think teams are equipped in order to use detection tools?
They can be equipped given the right program, right? So just to leverage on the point that John and Asher made mention, it is important for the business to understand basically their revenue, right, where they're getting their revenue and the technology that supports the revenue, because that kind of equivocates where, this particular technology has a higher hack value to this cracker as compared to this particular technology, and in so doing they would know better which ones to really put in place more mitigation efforts. And having said that, it's also important, and this is something that I've seen in my consulting practice, they do the first step but they don't follow through, right? So the topic really is vulnerability management, but we should not stop there. We should go and conduct the next step, which is penetration testing. I always believe that vulnerability management tells you basically what is the problem, but it doesn't tells you how bad is the problem. Penetration testing does that for you. All right. So I would really love a lot of companies to basically do a three-prong approach. Let me take a step back. Number one, they've got to conduct a periodic risk assessment of their technology and business process. It all boils down to that, first and foremost. Second of all, by identifying the risk criteria and the scores, we would be in a better position to say, okay, I'm going to conduct further penetration testing if there is an exploit or vulnerability found in the vulnerability assessment report. And then from there, continue to do this as part of the company policy on a periodic basis, right? So with that being said, I think that could already address 95% of all your vulnerabilities and exploits.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to kind of move on to and extend a little bit on that conversation you just had there, because you say teams don't follow up. And so John, when we're talking about some action items, so say that there was an event, threat was detected, what are some of the action items that should follow?
So I think it's kind of interesting when we're talking about these things, because we're using some of these terms in kind of unique ways. Like what I just talked about in the previous question, like we talked about that as a vulnerability analysis. That's not really vulnerability analysis. That's really trying to that's threat analysis, right? And to Danny's point, like threat analysis can tell you everything in the front of like what we see threat actors doing, but until you get somebody in there breaking it apart and really doing it, if you don't, somebody else is going to. And I think like when you're talking about, the action items, if you do identify a threat being detected, it kind of really depends on the nature of the threat. When we're looking at this, let's say that, is it being exploited? Oh, hey, we have this new app we rolled out there and clients are saying, hey, they're losing money out of their bank accounts. Can we validate it? That's no longer a threat. That is an incident. And you need, and ideally, like if it's money leaving accounts, it's not your red team either. So you know that, oh, that's out the door too. So you have an active incident that you have to deal with. And now you're really just talking about, Persical or whatever your particular methodology is for trying to triage it, making sure you scope it, making sure you go through it and dealing with it. I'm not going to dive too deeply into that because I think DFIR is a whole other wormhole of discussion that we could spend a lot of time diving down into. I think what you would initially see in the landscape, though, is you're not the only bank that's doing this. And if you are, you're probably one of the biggest. Right? You don't see financial institutions being like, hey, we want to be first in trying to roll a new app to market. Usually, and this is not a being disparaging to financial institutions, generally that's a really risky position to take. If you're doing a brand new service, a brand new application that does brand new infrastructure and brand new everything, let somebody else roll that out first, and then we'll see how well that goes. Because you're going to be seeing this as the third or fourth party identifying that, hey, there's somebody else rolled an app out like that, similar to this. A retail store has rolled out a way to cryptocurrency, and let's look at the tax service there. You're going to see that on the threat landscape, actors have responded to this as, hey, we think that these are fundamentally weak, and we think they can be cracked. Does anybody have any information? Does anybody got a POC or vulnerability against this? I'm willing to pay. And that's really, you're going to be your kind of the, now I'm trying to think of ships that are surfacing and what you call them, but like, that's going to be your first thing that you spot on the horizon, is that there's actor interest in whatever your surface is, because it's probably not completely novel. And it's probably that there's somebody else that's going to be interested in, like, how do we exploit it? And from there on, you can start thinking about, all right, how close is ours aligned to it? If it's very close, then we have to think, do we take proactive steps to shut this down, or do we keep it out there? And I don't want to get into the Fight Club equation of like, all right, we're going to lose this much money if we keep it up, or we're going to lose this much money if we don't. But in terms of what we do in security, that's ultimately what you have to do. It's all about risk, and risk at the end of the day is all about dollars. How much money are we set up to potentially lose, and what's the chance of us actually losing at it? And I think like you need to really pay attention to what the probability comes out at. And I think that, when you're looking at it, like, all right, we see this threat, what's the likelihood that we actually do it? Boil it down to dollars, boil it down to a probability in dollars. And it may not seem like a lot, but like, let's say that you are like, we have a 1% chance of being hit of our app being hit today. Well, great. That doesn't sound like a lot, but you roll it out the course of the year, that means you're going to get 3 major hacks over the course of the year at least. Like, so you really need to get a good fundamental understanding of how much is that going to cost me per incident, and then am I prepared to pay that cost? To me, that's the action item of like kind of that threat that you first see on the horizon, and making sure that you have somebody looking, someone attuned to it, someone paying attention to that. To roll into that last point that you made on the last discussion of, are people able to handle tools like that? Are people thinking about that? I would go so far as to say, in your organization, somebody probably is. Are you listening? Is it an analyst? If you're a very, very small team, you're probably not prepared to have somebody on the horizon of that. So maybe you've outsourced that. Do you have a MSP? Do you have some other organization that's paying attention to it? Because somebody should be, especially for brand new threat that you're surfacing there, because that's critical to you being able to stay ahead of that adversary.
Okay, so I think you've identified a few points here, because you have to be so future looking. The first question I asked you were talking about, hey, you should have been looking at this like a year ago. So say that you end up with this new threat that's coming on the horizon, and you've just kind of noticed it, and you start thinking about it. What am I going to consider in terms of ease of actually trying to create some, not action items, but how am I actually going to then try and work through it and solve it? Like, how easy is it to actually action it then, to execute on those items?
So there's a few things that give you wiggle room, and that's kind of why like this scenario is interesting and challenging, and we can dig into it. I'm going to make 3 presumptions right off the bat. Number 1, you're getting this app today, which means that it's somebody's pushed this out there. It's come from product management or some type of internal app management that's coming to you as a security, and the first you're hearing about it is just prior to launch. Number 2, because you just hearing about it now, you're probably not very well into those teams. Whether it's the CISO is new, whether it's you haven't had a historically good relationship between app developers and baking AppSec or DevSecOps in there, you just don't talk with those teams very well. So they probably overlooked a lot of the inherent type of security mindset that you'd want to instill in them. And number three, if that's the state of your organization, you're probably relatively, I don't want to say immature, but you haven't baked in as much into that idea of intelligence leading your organization. How is that perspective? What do we have to be thinking about to make sure that we don't get a major hack there? And so those set up an environment that's kind of interesting. I guess the fourth precept of that is you're thinking about it, which means that you exist in that organization. Someone who has an intelligence mindset is in that organization, is thinking about it with enough foresight to be like, all right, this is getting handed to me. So something in that process is nascent, but at least it's happening. And I need to figure out what to do right now. The first one for me is always, if this is brand new and I don't understand the technology, get up to speed on it. Where are actors doing something with that technology? Maybe the app is you could do it. Maybe it's primarily a mobile app. Let's look at things. What's the mobile app surface actually look like? We know that actors are targeting app stores, but are they looking at developing anything directly targeting the app, or is it all in like kind of environmental? And by environmental, I mean, they use your brand's name, they use your logo image, but they produce a secondary app that's on the side of it. It's not a direct attack, but they say, hey, we know they're launching it. They're doing a lot of media campaign around it. We're just going to throw another app in the app store. Maybe people misclick. Maybe we can register similar and typo squatted domains that look a lot like it to take advantage of this app surface that they have there, even though we're not directly targeting the app. Maybe they're doing phishing campaigns, and start looking at that and saying, hey, are we monitoring these spaces as we're looking at that threat picture developing, just in case something does happen? Those are all things that realistically a single analyst can do, with some level of scripting ability. Or you can have a tool like Recorded Future that can set up alerts and run it that way. Or there's other tools as well. But you can do this with a single analyst being forward thinking enough to be able to provide that perspective there. And you can go on and on and on about that. The second thing is a little bit harder. Let's dive into the particular app, and are there vulnerabilities? Are there things that we need to do? And that's what Danny was talking about earlier, that you have to get somebody who's either has the tooling, has the capability, has a skill, ideally all three, to be able to dive in deeply on that app and provide that mindset to that security team of like, these are critical risks. And the third thing that I think nobody talks about, which is just as critical, is you need leadership on board. Are they willing? What is the furthest they're willing to push this? Is somebody willing to shut it down if we think, hey, if we launch this, this is seriously critical to our entire company? Our entire client base could be defrauded because of this app, anybody who downloads it. How bad is that thing? Because you need a stakeholder there who's going to go to bat for you and say, this is serious. We have to put a pause on it. I don't care if it costs us $1 million in rolling out. We can't spend the hundreds of millions of dollars it's going to cost us if we roll something out there that's flawed. And so you need to make sure that you're investing in that organization, making sure you don't just have leadership bought on, but hey, this kind of came to me. We need to have better apps. We need to get better into these developers area. We need to try and make sure that we're bridging and building those connections, not just in our security organization, but external as well, to leadership, to security leadership, to legal, because I can tell you, if you've ever handled an incident, legal is your best friend or your worst enemy. And, are we making those connections today?
Right. And I think that's really interesting, particularly your, linking the risks that you mentioned. What's the risks that we have from a probability perspective, and linking that to leadership? Because I feel like nothing really moves leadership until you start to show them this is what's going to happen if we do this. Kind of like a simple analysis from that perspective of, if we do this, this is what it's going to cost us most probably this year. And so thank you for linking those together. And I'm going to now present this question. I'm going to go to Asher, Denny, and then John on this before we start to open up some more questions from the audience. And if you don't have questions, audience, I got questions. So definitely going to get some answers from these advisors and presenters today. So Asher, I'm going to start with you. So what are some of the challenges in your view around acting upon threats in such an environment? And are there particular experiences you'd like to share?
So one thing I'll just build on what John mentioned. It's that aspect of quantifying your risks and vulnerability and presenting them in a meaningful manner to the leadership, or the executive leadership, because without that, the ball doesn't go anywhere. So when it comes to answer your question, I mean, what we've seen right now, especially given the pandemic, and this is strictly because of the pandemic, organizations from all scales and sizes and industrial verticals are asking the question when it comes to insurance, because organizations have to be insured, but then the icing on the cake is the cyber insurance. And given the current ecosystem and the threat landscape, it is very hard, almost an impossible task to get the appropriate coverage, And that actually becomes more critical when you are dealing with personally identifiable data. Having critical information that has its weight in gold, in again a dark market where you would have, again, this whole conversation regarding genesis is eye-opening, because then your personas are created in a much more vast manner. The biggest again learning from this, and the biggest challenge is getting adequate quantifiable metrics that could be presented in layman's term without complicating conversation with technical jargon, making sure your executive leadership is on board. They understand what is the impact for the organization, just not from the technical standpoint, from an organization reputation standpoint as well. And once you have that buy-in, then you move forward. That is, I think, the biggest pushback or the lack of an area where development needs to be made in a progressive manner.
Thank you. Danny, what are
Right.
some of your
So
challenges or your views on the challenges? Sorry. go
right.
ahead.
So yeah, thank you. Um, so currently, right now, I'm working with a client going through ISO 27001, and anecdotally, I just would like to share with you that, pretty much the company, when you actually present them the actual risk management methodology, they get that, right? They from the methodology framework that you draft, and then the actual risk assessment, then the risk treatment, and then the statement of applicability, and all goes through the actual final report. But one thing I've noticed that has always been a gap is that senior leadership team, always have different measurement in terms of the risk appetite. We can talk all day about risk assessment and risk management, and everybody is going to just say, yeah, you're preaching to the choir. But one thing that is like the elephant in the room whenever you're talking about risk assessment is the risk appetite. Senior leadership team has different level of risk appetite. DevOps have different level of appetites. Legal has different level of appetites. So basically, the problem is that if the risk appetite is different, the risk criticality and the risk rating is different, and the risk treatment is going to envelope in that. And so what you have in the end is a completed document that will pass ISO 27001 audit, but it's an organized chaos, right? There's no standard. So that's one thing that we need to take care about. The risk appetite needs to have complete buy-in from senior leadership team all the way down, right? It just cannot be one particular vertical or horizontal functional department of the company. That having said, number two, when it comes to, a while ago you mentioned something like, so what will company do in an attack, in the case of an attack? Well, incident management is really crucial here, right? So it's important that there's going to be one particular owner or champion that is managing the risk of the incident management, both internal and externally submitted ticket. And at the same time, for each particular thread of that incident, there's got to be a run book. This is what we need to do. This is what we need to do, because you really will not be able to have, predictively analyze all the possible permutations of the type of attacks that will come in. You don't know what you don't know, right? So it's important that you have some sort of a run book to say this particular, if it is a man in the middle, or if it's a sniffing, or it's a website defacement, right? This would be the run book. This will be the owner within the company who has the power, that influence, that to say, okay, DevOps manager, do this, legal, do this, and so forth and so on. That being said, again, one of the things that I always tell my client is that, for a stopgap measure, try to implement an IDPS, an intrusion detection prevention system. It could be in a form of a SIEM solution. If you're in a cloud-based on Azure farm, you can use Sentinel, but it kind of help you triage whether it's a false positive or a false negative, and then the actual incident management process will kick in to determine which among the run book you're going to actually put to play.
Thank you, Danny. And John?
I just want to play off one comment that Danny said, and I think it's really critical. Run books are essential, especially during your incident. But a thing that's going to be a special note of, if this is a brand new app, is you have to figure out, does this roll into every other campaign, or is this novel? If it's like a phishing attack, if it's a standard thing and all they've done is kind of use the branding that you've come up with around the app, that's one thing. You should have standard run books for that, and that's a thing, right? Like, you should be able to deal with that. If it's a novel attack that's specifically targeted on this particular app, you better make sure that you have somebody in the organization that your security team can call, because you will not know what's going on with that. You better get an app developer who's able to sit there side by side with you and get you up to speed on what's actually happening there, because you're going to have a lot of questions that no one's going to be able to answer. So you need to make sure that you build the bridge today for that incident if it's going to come through.
Thank you. And are there any experiences, Danny? Well, Danny, you did share, but John, any experiences that you'd like to share about operating in any particular or such environment?
So most of my experience, and like, well, one, I think NDAs are kind of the thing that we just all have to deal with. But like a lot of my experience, and I'm going to pull back from this, is saying, I've always been an intelligence professional for most of my life. So whenever I think about what the role of intelligence in an organization is, it's always advisory, right? Like I have done digital forensics, I've done, and I've worked in organizations, but I'm nowhere near an expert in like DFIR. I'm not going to tell you about how it's run, and even if I could, it's expired because it changes every few years, right? Like people are now talking about rolling special forces type of operations and that mindset into incident response, because maybe this is a better, more applicable model to how we should be thinking about adversary tactics and response there, as opposed to, when I came through, I remember a lot of forensics was, half of it was legal cases, right? We got to get a copy of this machine because we're getting sued, and somebody needs to make sure you get over there and get a forensic copy of it and then ship it to Iron Mountain so that, or someplace else, so that you can make sure that you have it on record, and then no one's ever going to look at it again. And the rest of the time it was, okay, we have an incident. Did DLP trigger? Nope. Did we have anything novel in it? Nope. Burn it to the ground and reset, right? I don't think that much in that part has changed. But I think like one of the things that we have seen is we're seeing the intelligence being a little bit more brought into the game and brought into a higher level perspective. And I think that's really critical when you're thinking about how organizations are dealing with not just preparation, but also in the middle of an incident. Here's why. If you look at how the military is structured, you have intelligence sitting right next to operations. You have, so if you're not familiar with this, you have like a J1, which is your operations group there. You have a J2, which is your intelligence, and J3, oh, sorry, J1 is like logistics administration. J2 is your intelligence, J3 is your operations, so how are troops moving and stuff like that. And it goes on down the chain. When you look at security organizations, which, let's be honest, we have a lot of pseudo-military type of applications that have fed into how we develop and how we think about security, you don't see that same kind of organizational alignment. You have intelligence kind of buried. Sometimes it's ops, sometimes it's standalone, but very often it's underneath that. And so as a CISO, you're requiring your director of ops or whoever that is to give you both an intelligence perspective, which tends to be more forward-looking and more holistic and threat-based, as well as the operations perspective, which is very defensive, very in the weeds, and how are we aligning that? And I think you're starting to see organizations that are pulling that out and saying, hey, we need both an intelligence perspective on where threat actors, what are they actually doing, as well as an operational perspective of what are we doing against that. And nowadays, you tend to get that intelligence perspective from red teams. You're seeing a lot more red teams and a lot more advisory groups kind of coming in there and saying, hey, this is what your groups are doing. This is where you're at. This is where we think your threat model actually is. And I kind of see that enhancing and like kind of maturing over time, of where they're saying, hey, let's bring this knowledge in-house, so let's formalize it a bit more and think about like, how do we not just have it as like a threat hunt team or a threat intel team or a like some kind of red team that's buried inside of ops, but make it an independent thing that's going to tell me what is that threat perspective, how are we looking at them, and how are we prepared to respond to them if they do strike us.
Thank you very much. I think the experience that you've mentioned here is critical, especially the change that's happening. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for any questions that are coming from the audience, and I think they're going to drop into the chat we have here at our end. While we're waiting on that, I'm going to actually ask this for everyone. John, early on in the conversation, you mentioned a modern platform, because it surprises me to this day how many people deploy with just HTTP or just a straight endpoint that doesn't have any sort of SSL on it. So I'm going to ask each one of you three, and then perhaps you'll like share with each other as well, or have some commonality, what you consider to be a modern platform for example, an app being deployed. So John, I'm going to start with you.
That's a loaded question. I mean, I think in a modern platform, and mind you, I'm a security person, not a like DevOps. Actually, I'm more an intelligent person than anything like that. So that perspective is tainted. But I think one deployed using modern infrastructure, up-to-date infrastructure, and proper coding standards, right? Like we don't often think about CI/CD in a structured fashion. If you're not familiar, by the way, that's like continuous integration, continuous development, like a model of that you get from most SaaS companies, right? I don't think about it just updates itself and does things magically. Realistically, in most organizations, it may not always happen like that. Number two, like what are we actually building this base off of? Like I hate to kind of pull back the layer, but most of your development is not on modern standards. Like I think there's a lot of organizations that are trying to peel off and get off of Ubuntu 16.04 and to get up to like 20. And I think that would shock a lot of people, but are we trying to make those active efforts to modernize? Are we trying to make those active efforts to get on the latest version of Elastic? I can't remember what they're on right now. Is it 18? But you have a lot of organizations that are just very, they were built on one thing and they just can't migrate off of it for whatever reason. I mean, at a base level, how many organizations around the world do you think are still running Windows 95 in some way, whether they purchased extended or they just are running it because they think that they mitigated the risk? They were using it on a testbed instance that exists in a manufacturing shop. They can't update it because they don't know how, and they're never going to rewrite it. And it has to be there because that legacy machine or whatever it is supporting something that one or two clients are paying for, right? And they're just going to leave it there. They're not going to touch it. They're not going to update it. It's not worth it for them financially, but it's there and it's still connected to part of their network, right? Is that modern? Is it not? I would go so far as to say, like, you can do all the best coding practice and everything, but like for me, the idea, hallmark of a modern organization, modern infrastructure is, have we at least taken that risk into perspective? One, do we know about that machine? Two, have we thought about how do we plan on dealing with it? You're never going to be on the latest up-to-date software and infrastructure. And like I said, financial organizations in particular are risk adverse. They're not going to want the latest update. It's not like any of our organizations are like, sweet, they rolled out the latest patch of Windows. Let's do it today. Let's do it right now. No, we don't know what it's going to break. We don't know what's going to cause, what problems it's going to do there. So you're always going to be a bit behind. It's important, though, that your organization knows exactly how far behind you are. Where are you? What risk are you accepting when you do it? To me, that's the hallmark of a modern organization, is that at least you know what you're agreeing to. It's not a tacit, I don't know, I guess there's probably some stuff, but we'll be off COBOL in a year or two, said every engineer and developer that I know for the past 20 years.
All right, Danny, your thoughts?
Sure. That's a very good segue in generalizing what it would look like. But specifically, if you're going to ask me about the specific technologies I'm going to deploy, to me, my definition of a modern infrastructure would be, making sure that you have every remediation controls in place for every security layer when you deploy your security in-depth framework. That being said, I can say start if it is a web-based application, make sure you have a web application firewall or a WAF, right? Could be Zscaler, it could be Cloudflare, take your pick, right? If you're talking about the actual data privacy concern, making sure that the data in transit is both the client side and the web server side only accepts TLS 1.2 and above. The data at rest portion is AES 256. And there's one thing that I've noticed in a lot of consulting that I did. Whenever you ask the DevOps about, okay, so what particular encryption technology you're putting in place, they always know the TLS and the AES, the data at rest and data in motion. But what they don't realize is that that's only addressing the confidentiality part of the CIA triage, right? The integrity part is not TLS, it's not AES, it's hashing. And you will be surprised that there's not a lot of company that is actually employing hashing algorithm in their data at rest database. So we all have to go back to the basic of CIA and making sure that you've got controls, mitigation controls in place for every security layer of your infrastructure, and that to me is basically the modern infrastructure.
Okay, Asher, your perspective?
I'll just try to add on the points that both Danny and John built. I mean, it comes with what John alluded to is the legacy or the technical debt that the organization accumulated over years and decades and many moons of work as an organization grows. And if a Windows 7 app works, then if it's not broken, why fix it? And then that's the methodology that the organization pursues upon accumulating more debt. From a technical standpoint, from a platform building, again, it's building defense in there. So make sure as an organization, you have your SIEM running, you have IDS, IPS. But when it comes to the application itself, again, a web application firewall is just the basic principles. Having some sort of load balancer, check and balancing again. If a malicious intent is hitting the traffic, you have legitimate stops and checks to pull those, identify the end users so that people can pick up and act on it in a very proactive manner instead of reacting when something has happened after the fact. So I think that's what it is. But again, as an organization, we've all seen that there is a technical debt that we're all faced with. So it's managing those, but also keeping the lights on and then looking forward. The last piece of the puzzle as an organization is making sure that the demographics that are producing work are up to par. So you are, again, bringing in regular new blood and making sure that the old folks, the veterans that have been in the trade for the longest time are up to par with the latest and greatest threat landscape, as well as the technology stacks that are out there.
Thank you. We've got a question from the audience and from those that are participating. And John, I think I'm going to have to ask you to answer this one. Are there any privacy concerns that emerge when tracking and analyzing financial transactions?
Well, I think it depends on what financial transactions we're talking about, right? Like if you're, I think the fundamental like frame of this particular conversation was really around digital currencies. And when you're talking about that, by inherent nature, they are open, right? Like if you're turning cryptocurrency or doing something like that, then no, I don't think you don't want privacy as a security feature, right? Like as that complete transparency is designed to try and make it, more open. I guess the whole sunshine is the best antiseptic type of approach there. When you're looking at other types of financial transactions, I think it depends on who you are and what you're looking at, if that makes any sense. Like we've long known that like governments always look at financial transactions. In fact, most financial organizations in here have some kind of obligation to report to their organizations, whether it's law enforcement, and law enforcement often works with like other groups as well to try and figure out like, hey, what is actually going on here, whether it's financing for terrorism, whether it's looking into like fraudulent accounts, whether it's just looking at whether or not people are doing something like check kiting, or are we staying ahead of that? That's, by the way, I couldn't believe it. Check kiting is still a thing. It's really out there. But I think like, when I think about privacy and when I think about the concerns of it, I don't think about it, I guess, as concerning as others may. And that's because I know that most of the organizations that are doing this are looking at it at scale. Even when you're talking about like bulk collection by the NSA or bulk collection by, I apologize, I don't actually know what Canada's version of the NSA actually is. But like, I just assume the Mounties do everything. Because by the way, as far as a law enforcement agency, I love the Mounties. Those guys are great. I served with them in Iraq. They're just amazing. But you're doing things in bulk. Even if as a company trying to look at transactions, you're not doing it on an individual basis. You're doing it in bulk, trying to look at for large scale anomalies because you have way too much data and way too little time to be able to analyze it. So I guess for me, the privacy concerns are mitigated, but ultimately anything that you do, whether it's intelligence, whether it's security, whether we're diving into it, we have to remember that at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, it's people. The people are the ones that you're trying to serve as a company, as an organization. The people are the ones who are trying to attack it and defraud you at one side, and the people are the ones who are trying to defend you. And if you don't have elemental respect for that, then we should probably just look at getting a different profession.
All right, thank you. And I believe, just to answer your question there, Canada's version of the NSA, as is any country in the world, is the NSA, because it's just looking out for all of us, right? So there was a second part to that question is how difficult and kind of what issues are encountered when you're doing cross-border intelligence sharing? Because I think that is an issue, especially when you start to end up with larger organizations, multinationals as well.
It depends on which border. Right? Like, I mean, if you want to talk about rivalries, like you get one financial organization to share threat information with another financial organization, even ones that are organizations are designed for it, like FSISAC. I mean, the longstanding challenge with FSISAC, and this is brought up by members and talked about pretty openly, so I don't think I'm spilling any secrets here, is that you have some organizations that all want to share and you have other organizations that are never going to share. And being able to have that type of, sharing intelligence, being able to share that, like what are we actually sharing and what's the nature of it and what's the shared value for all? I think that when you're talking about, like, I think specifically they're talking about intelligence sharing across international boundaries. I think you're starting to see kind of two things that are opposing, and I don't know which one's going to win. One is this balkanization of like internet, and we think about like data laws and privacy laws and how they're actually applying and what countries are doing what. We obviously know like there's countries that we just don't want to provide any information to whatsoever. Like not to put too fine a point on it, but like Iran, North Korea, Russia's kind of in there, where it's like, hey, anything that's going over there, where you're getting into a lot of laws there that are going to be preventing you from operating legally in those environments. Then there's a lot of organizations, and I think it's really up to your organization what the relationship is there. That like, hey, what intelligence we share, where do we get it from, and how do we actually provide it there? International banks that may have like a U.S. presence or a Canadian presence or a German presence, but at the same time have like a Cuban presence or have a, I don't know, is Germany versus France still a thing? I know Italy versus England certainly is. Oh, that's right. I put in a Euro 2020 joke. But like you have these kind of cross-border things, and you have to have ultimately respect for what those laws are. But it's becoming really challenging, even within countries, even inside the United States. There's a myriad of state laws and provisions about that you're trying to follow, and you're trying to figure out how do we operate legally in those environments, and what's that risk to the business. Ultimately, to me, that's a GRC type of focus. I think you need to know your environments, know your regulations, know whether or not we're in compliance or not. And that's the first and foremost guiding point for anything else that you do, up to including intelligence sharing.
Thank you very much. And I think we have reached our time for this session. I will hear someone in my ears tell me if that isn't the case, but I'd like to thank you, John, Asher, and Danny for joining in today. Big thanks. I think you've definitely hit upon extremely important points here. And we keep coming back to risk. We keep coming back to organizational change as well, organizational management. And I do appreciate the insight of each and every one of you. From everyone here, thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in some of our other sessions. Thank you.
I know.